Strap in, everyone. This deep dive, well, it's going to turn everything you thought you knew about Islam's origins upside down.
Really makes you wonder.
We've got some fascinating stuff to explore, suggesting Islam might have begun in the Levant.
Not the Arabian desert like we're usually told.
Exactly. It's a potential paradigm shift. And the really cool part, it all starts with poetry.
Oh, that's interesting.
You sent in some research by Dr. Khaled Waleed, and he uses Islamic poetry, specifically poems often labeled as pre-Islamic.
Ah, I see.
To argue for this Levantine origin story.
So we're talking about looking for clues hidden in plain sight.
Yeah, no ancient ruins or scrolls. We're diving into the words of these ancient poets.
I like it. Dr. Waleed's approach treats these poems as historical and geographical records.
Okay, so they're more than just beautiful verses. They're actual windows into the past.
Precisely. And he argues that these poems, even though they're labeled pre-Islamic, are actually jam-packed with details that point more towards the Levant than the Arabian desert.
All right, give me an example. What kind of details are we talking about?
Let's take the poet Al-Shanfara, for instance.
Okay.
He uses this term al-Isra, which is directly connected to the Prophet Muhammad's night journey to Jerusalem.
Right.
Now think about it. If Islam started in Mecca, which is hundreds of miles from Jerusalem, why would a supposedly pre-Islamic poet in the Arabian desert be using this term?
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's like finding Big Ben mentioned in a story about, I don't know, ancient Egypt.
Yeah.
It just doesn't fit.
It makes you wonder, doesn't it? Dr. Waleed sees this as evidence that these poets were already familiar with early Islamic concepts and stories, which suggests they were all part of the same intellectual world in the Levant.
Like a shared space where ideas were bouncing around.
Exactly, like an early internet. Think about it. Ideas traveling along trade routes, and poetry was the social media of the day.
I love that analogy.
Yeah.
So these Islamic terms popping up in Levantine poetry, it could mean that these core concepts of Islam were already being discussed and debated in this region long before the traditional narrative puts them in Mecca.
That's the core of the argument.
Wow. And it's not just terms, right? Dr. Waleed finds other geographical and cultural clues, too.
Oh, yeah. Loads of them.
Okay, you got to give me another example. I'm hooked.
All right, let's take a look at Oz ibn Hujr.
Okay.
He mentions Yathrib and olive oil in one of his poems.
Yathrib. That's the old name for Medina, right? The city's so closely linked to the Prophet Muhammad, but olive oil, what's the connection there?
Well, Dr. Waleed connects this to a verse in the Quran that mentions olives. And guess what? Olive trees, they thrive in the Levant, not the Arabian desert.
Ah, so it's another geographical marker pointing away from the traditional setting?
It's a subtle clue, but it's a powerful one.
Yeah, it's like these specific locations and even like agricultural products are lining up with the Levant. It's as if Dr. Waleed is piecing together a map, not just of ideas, but of a real place. This is getting really interesting. Did Dr. Waleed find any other poets whose work supports this theory?
Oh, absolutely. He looks at a poem by Al-Aqtal, who describes a tribe with practices that sound a lot like those of the early Muslims.
Okay.
And get this, Al-Aqtal even uses terms like dinar and dirham, which were currencies used in the Byzantine Empire.
Wow, okay, that further links things to the Levant.
It's pretty compelling evidence.
The detail is incredible, but, and I have to ask this, how much can we really trust poetry as historical evidence? I mean, it's open to interpretation, right?
You're right. Poetry is definitely open to different interpretations. However, Dr. Waleed's approach is really interesting. He focuses on these really concrete geographical and historical references.
Right.
Not vague symbols or anything like that. He's meticulously building this case based on tangible evidence.
So he's not just saying like, oh, this feels Levantine.
Yeah.
He's pointing to specific names, places, even economic systems that line up with the Levant in a way that's pretty hard to dismiss.
Exactly. And while, some scholars might offer other interpretations, I think Dr. Waleed's work presents a really strong case, one that should be taken seriously.
I'm starting to see how these poems could really challenge traditional historical narratives. It's definitely making me rethink what I thought I knew about early Islam. What other poets did Dr. Waleed look at?
Well, he dives into the works of several others, each one offering another piece of the puzzle.
Oh, interesting.
Like, for instance, there's a poem by Abu al-Mahari.
Al-Mahari. Wasn't he like a bit of a skeptic, when it came to organized religion? I'm curious how he fits into this whole Levantine origin thing.
That's what makes Dr. Waleed's analysis so fascinating.
Okay.
Al-Mahari, even though he was critical of certain religious practices, he might actually, unintentionally of course, provides support for the Levantine origin theory. Dr. Waleed points to a poem where al-Mahari criticizes the Hajj.
The Hajj.
Yeah, he describes it as a, well, journey of pagans.
Hold on, how does criticizing the Hajj support a Levantine origin? I'm not following.
Well, Dr. Waleed's argument is that the way al-Mahari describes the Hajj, it doesn't really match up with what we associate with the Islamic Hajj today.
He picks out these lines where al-Mahari is talking about people doing things that sound more like pre-Islamic rituals, maybe even pagan rituals, around the Kaaba.
So you're saying al-Mahari might have been witnessing something totally different from what later became the Islamic Hajj. That's a pretty bold idea.
It is bold, for sure, and probably one of the most controversial parts of Dr. Waleed's research.
Yeah.
He's suggesting that what al-Mahari saw was this mix of different religious practices, some of them rooted in much older traditions, all happening in a place that might have been seen as sacred long before Islam came along.
Okay, so we've got these poets. Some seem to be embracing early Islamic ideas. Then we have others like al-Mahari who seem to be describing something else entirely. It's almost like looking at two different pictures of the same place, but years apart. How does Dr. Waleed make sense of these seemingly contradictory accounts?
He sees it as evidence of a period of transition, a time of change.
Right.
Imagine the Levant back then, this melting pot of ideas. Jewish, Christian, pagan traditions, all mixing together.
That's it. And Dr. Waleed's point is that these poems, they're like snapshots of this dynamic time, this period of religious ferment, where what we now call Islam was still kind of taking shape.
So instead of a sudden, clear-cut revelation, it was more of a gradual evolution, a blending of different traditions over time.
Exactly. And that's what makes Dr. Waleed's work so compelling. He's not giving us easy answers. He's pushing us to question assumptions, to consider different perspectives.
I'm all for that. So if these poets were living and writing in the Levant, where does Mecca fit into all of this?
That's where things get really interesting. Dr. Waleed, along with other researchers like Dan Gibson and Petra Crown, they suggest that the Mecca mentioned by these poets, it wasn't the city in the Arabian desert that we know today.
Wait, hold on. Are you saying that the Mecca we know today, the holiest city in Islam, that wasn't the original Mecca?
That's what their research points towards.
Wow.
They argue that the way Mecca is described, the geography and all in Islamic texts, including this early poetry, matches up better with Petra.
Petra. The ancient city, you know, the one carved into those cliffs?
That's the one.
That's a huge claim. I mean, that would rewrite Islamic history as we know it. What kind of evidence is there for this?
They present a bunch of different pieces of evidence. For example, they look at the direction of prayer in early mosques.
Okay.
And according to their research, these directions align with Petra, not Mecca. They also look at the trade routes at the time, and their argument is that Petra was this major hub for trade, while Mecca, the one we know today, wasn't really on the map, so to speak.
Right, so their argument is that early Muslims were centered around Petra, and then at some point, everything shifted to the Mecca we know now. Wouldn't a shift that be, I mean, wouldn't it have left some kind of trace in the historical record?
You've hit on one of the big debates among scholars.
Oh.
Some say a change that significant would have definitely been documented, while others argue that maybe there were political or religious reasons why such a shift might have been, I don't know, hidden or lost to history.
Yeah, it's a really complex issue, and it doesn't sound like there's a clear answer.
Yeah, it's a controversial topic, and the debate's far from settled.
This whole deep dive is like, I don't know, like falling down a rabbit hole. You think you know something, and then boom, everything gets flipped on its head.
That's the beauty of history.
Yeah.
It's all about challenging what we think we know and exploring these different ways of interpreting the past.
Right, and that's exactly what Dr. Waleed's research is encouraging us to do. I have to admit, I'm a bit skeptical, but definitely intrigued. What other evidence does Dr. Waleed use to support this idea of Petra as the original Mecca?
Well, he talks about this recurring theme of water sources in the poetry.
Water.
Yeah, these poets, even though they're often portrayed as desert dwellers, they keep mentioning rivers, springs, lush vegetation.
That doesn't exactly sound like the desert landscape we usually picture when we think about early Islam.
Exactly. Dr. Waleed connects those descriptions to the abundance of water in the Levant, which again supports his argument. He even analyzes a poem by Al-Shanfara, remember him, the one who talked about Al-Isra?
Yeah.
Well, in this poem, he talks about seeking refuge in a cave with his companions.
Okay.
And Dr. Waleed points out that the area around Petra, it's actually known for having a ton of caves, and people used to live in them all the time back in the day.
So the actual landscape of Petra with the caves and all the water, it matches the descriptions in these columns.
It all starts to line up.
It's like we're piecing together a real place, not just a bunch of ideas. This is fascinating.
Yeah.
But if we go with this idea of a Levantine Mecca, I mean, what does it mean for how we understand early Islam's relationship with, other religions like Judaism and Christianity?
That's a great question, and it's a really important one.
Yeah.
The Levant, it's always been this crossroads of different beliefs. You had Jewish communities, Christian communities, all sorts of traditions mixing together. So if early Islam developed in this kind of environment, like Dr. Waleed suggests, it paints a much more complex picture than the traditional story of a sudden revelation in the desert.
Yeah, it would mean that early Islam maybe grew through conversations and exchanges with these other faiths, gradually changing and developing over time.
Right. Instead of a clean break from the past, it's more like building on what was already there.
It makes you wonder if we've been oversimplifying things, the whole story of how Islam began.
That's what makes history so interesting, right? It's not just a fixed set of facts. It's always changing, always open to new interpretations.
Yeah, and as we find new evidence and challenge old ideas, the way we understand the past can totally shift.
It's an ongoing process.
This deep dive has definitely changed how I see things. So to kind of sum it all up, if we entertain this possibility that Islam might have started in the Levant, what does that mean for how we understand the faith today?
That's a tough question, and honestly, I think each person has to wrestle with that on their own. But for me, the main takeaway from Dr. Waleed's work is that history is messy.
Yeah.
It's not black and white. It's full of shades of gray, full of different perspectives. Whether you agree with his conclusions or not, I think he's done a great job of forcing us to look at those complexities, to question what we thought we knew.
He's basically opened up this whole new way of looking at the history of Islam. And that's pretty mind-blowing.
It's exciting stuff.
It really is. This deep dive has taken us from the Arabian desert to the ancient city of Petra, all through the power of poetry. It just goes to show you, sometimes the most unexpected sources can give us the most amazing insights.
I couldn't agree more.
This has been a wild ride. We've uncovered hidden clues, challenged traditional narratives, and honestly ended up with more questions than answers.
And those questions, well, they're the starting point for even more exploration, more discovery.
Well said. As we wrap up this deep dive into the origins of Islam, I want to leave you with this. How does this new perspective, this idea of a Levantine beginning, how does it shape how you understand the faith, its history, its place in the world today? Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those amazing sources coming.